A queen's belly swelled for 11 months. Her breasts leaked milk. She felt the child kick inside her. But when the birthing chamber doors finally opened, nothing. No baby. No blood. Just a woman, alone, broken by her own body. If you want to witness the darkest secrets Tudor England tried to bury, hit subscribe now. Because what happened to Mary is a medical nightmare you won't believe. This is the true story of the phantom pregnancies that destroyed a queen, and how her own flesh became her greatest enemy. Mary Tudor was 37 years old when she finally claimed the throne that had been stolen from her since childhood. It was 1553, and England knelt before its first crowned queen regnant. But victory tasted like ash in her mouth. She had spent 20 years watching her father, Henry VIII, dismantle everything she loved. First came the annulment of her mother Catherine of Aragon's marriage, declared invalid as if 24 years meant nothing. Then came the declaration of illegitimacy. With a stroke of a pen, Mary transformed from Princess of England to royal bastard. Her household was dissolved, her jewels confiscated. She was forbidden from seeing her mother, who died alone in a cold manor house, heartbroken and body ravaged by illness. Mary herself nearly died during those years. A Venetian ambassador reported in 1531 that the teenage princess suffered from severe melancholy and hysteria, her body racked with mysterious pains and fevers. The physicians whispered that her wound might be damaged from the constant stress and grief, but no one dared speak it aloud. Now, 2 decades later, she wore the crown, but the throne felt unstable beneath her. England had been torn from the Catholic Church by her father's lust and her brother Edward's Protestant zealotry. The kingdom simmered with religious division. Worse still, her half-sister Elizabeth lurked in the shadows. Younger, Protestant, fertile, as far as anyone knew. Mary understood the brutal arithmetic of Tudor succession. Without an heir, everything she fought for would crumble the moment she closed her eyes for the last time. Elizabeth would inherit, and England would be lost to heresy forever. The Catholic Restoration, her mother's vindication, her entire life's purpose, hung on one impossible requirement. She needed a child, so Mary did what queens must do. She married for duty, not love. Philip of Spain arrived in July 1554, 11 years her junior, cold-eyed and calculating. He spoke no English. She spoke broken Spanish. Their wedding at Winchester Cathedral was magnificent and hollow. Philip's father, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, had orchestrated the match for political alliance, nothing more. Philip made no secret of his indifference. But Mary looked at him and saw salvation. Here was a Catholic prince, powerful and legitimate. Here was her chance to prove she was not the barren disappointment her father believed her to be. Here was the man who would give her the child that would save England's soul. The wedding night passed, then weeks, then months, and Mary began to notice changes in her body, changes she had prayed for her entire adult life, changes that made her heart surge with desperate, terrifying hope. The signs were unmistakable. By September, her monthly courses had stopped completely. Her body was finally answering her prayers, or so she believed. Within weeks, the symptoms intensified. Mary's gowns grew tight across her middle. She ordered her seamstresses to let out the waistlines, then let them out again. Her breasts became tender and swollen, sensitive to even the lightest touch of fabric. Every morning brought waves of nausea that left her retching into basins while her ladies-in-waiting exchanged knowing glances. The royal physicians were summoned. They examined her with cautious optimism, pressing their hands against her abdomen, asking intimate questions about her body's rhythms. Their verdict came swift and certain. Queen Mary was with child. The heir to England was growing in her womb. The news exploded through the court like wildfire. Parliament convened in emergency session and passed the Regency Act, declaring that if Mary died in childbirth, Philip would rule as regent until the child came of age. It was an extraordinary gesture, granting unprecedented power to a foreign king. But England needed certainty. The kingdom needed an heir. Mary herself transformed. The melancholy that had shadowed her for decades lifted like morning fog. She smiled. She laughed. She placed her hands on her belly and whispered prayers of gratitude to the Virgin Mary, her namesake and protector. Finally, after 37 years of suffering and humiliation, God was rewarding her faithfulness. By November, there was no hiding it. Her belly protruded visibly beneath her elaborate gowns. Courtiers bowed deeper when she passed, their eyes drawn to the swell of her abdomen. Foreign ambassadors sent excited dispatches to their monarchs. The Queen of England was pregnant. The succession was secured. Catholic England would endure. In December, Mary commissioned special celebratory music for the chapel, royal. Composers worked day and night to create hymns of thanksgiving. The court prepared for a spring birth. Cradles were carved from the finest oak. Wet nurses were interviewed and hired. Tiny gowns were stitched with gold thread. Across England, church bells rang. Bonfires blazed in village squares. Ale flowed freely in taverns as commoners toasted their queen's good fortune. After years of religious upheaval and uncertainty, here was hope. Here was continuity. Here was proof that God favored Mary's Catholic restoration. But in the private chambers of the palace, Philip was noticeably quiet. He wrote careful letters to his father in Spain, letters that lacked the joy one might expect from an expectant father. He watched his wife's belly grow with an expression that servants would later describe as doubt. Something about the way Mary clutched her abdomen, the desperate intensity in her eyes when she spoke of the child, unsettled him. He said nothing publicly. How could he? The entire kingdom was celebrating. To question the pregnancy now would be to question the Queen's word, the physician's expertise, the very will of God. So Philip smiled and nodded and played his role. But privately, he began counting the months and watching his wife with growing unease. The baby was due in April. Spring would bring either salvation or catastrophe. April arrived. As Tudor tradition demanded, Mary withdrew into confinement at Hampton Court Palace. The birthing chamber had been prepared according to ancient custom. Heavy tapestries covered every window, blocking out natural light. Only candlelight would illuminate the sacred space where England's heir would enter the world. The air grew thick and stifling, heated by constantly burning fires meant to keep the Queen warm during labor. The doors closed behind her. They would not open again until she emerged with her child. Inside that sealed chamber, time moved differently. Days blurred together in the perpetual twilight. Mary's ladies-in-waiting attended her in shifts, their whispers the only sound beyond the crackling of fire. Among them, by royal command, was Elizabeth, the Protestant princess forced to wait upon her Catholic sister, to witness the birth of the child who would push her further from the throne. But as April dragged toward May, something was clearly wrong. Mary had stopped eating. Trays of food were brought and removed untouched. Her physicians pleaded with her, warning that the child needed nourishment. She stared at them with hollow eyes and turned away. When she did speak, her words came in disjointed fragments. Prayers to the Virgin, mumblings about signs and omens, reassurances to herself that the baby would come soon, very soon. The attendants began to notice disturbing patterns. Mary would curl into a fetal position on her bed, rocking back and forth for hours, her arms wrapped around her swollen belly. Sometimes they found her on the floor, having collapsed from exhaustion. Other times she wept uncontrollably, her sobs echoing off the tapestried walls until her voice went raw. No one knew what to do. She was the Queen. They could not force her to eat or sleep. They could only watch as she deteriorated in that dark, airless room. Then, on the last day of April, a miracle, or so it seemed. A rumor erupted from the palace. The Queen had been delivered of a son. Church bells across London began to ring in wild celebration. Citizens poured into the streets, embracing strangers and shouting prayers of thanksgiving. Bonfires blazed. Wine flowed. England had an heir. The news raced across Europe. In Spain, Emperor Charles V received word of his grandson's birth with tears of joy. He immediately began planning the child's future, the marriages that would unite Catholic Europe, the destiny of this miraculous Tudor prince. But inside the sealed chamber at Hampton Court, there was only silence. No baby cried. No midwives called out announcements. The tapestries remained drawn. The doors stayed shut. The bells stopped ringing as confusion spread. Palace officials scrambled to correct the false report, but no explanation was given. How had such a rumor started? Who had lied? Or had someone simply wanted so desperately to believe that they convinced themselves it was true? May arrived. Then June. The baby was weeks overdue now, months overdue. And still, Mary insisted the child was coming. Still, she waited in that dark chamber, her mind fracturing as her body refused to deliver what had never existed. July brought unbearable heat to Hampton Court. Inside the sealed chamber, the air had become poisonous with the smell of sweat and despair. Mary's attendants whispered among themselves, their concern turning to fear. The Queen had been confined for 3 months now. This was not normal. This was not right. Outside the palace walls, England held its breath. No official announcement came. Ambassadors sent increasingly frantic letters to their home courts, admitting they had no information. The Italian ambassador, a man named Micheli, privately wrote words dripping with contempt. He suggested the pregnancy would likely end in wind rather than anything else. A cruel dismissal, but one that reflected the growing suspicion spreading through European courts. Inside, something was finally changing. Mary's belly, which had swelled so convincingly for 9 months, began to shrink. Slowly at first, then more noticeably. Her gowns hung looser. A tightness in her abdomen eased. But instead of relief, this brought only confusion and terror. She refused to acknowledge it. When her ladies mentioned the change, Mary turned her face to the wall and would not speak for hours. She insisted the child had simply moved, repositioned itself. The birth would come any day now. God was testing her faith. She had only to wait a little longer. But her physicians could no longer maintain the fiction. In early August, nearly 11 months after the pregnancy was first announced, they gathered the courage to speak the truth. There was no child. There had never been a child. Whatever had caused her symptoms, it was not pregnancy. The confrontation shattered something fundamental inside Mary. For days, she would not leave her bed. She stared at the tapestried ceiling, her face blank, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. The women who attended her reported that she seemed like a hollow shell, emptied of everything that had animated her. When the chamber doors finally opened and Mary emerged, the court barely recognized her. She had aged a decade in 3 months. Her face was gaunt, her eyes ringed with dark circles. She moved like a ghost through the corridors of her own palace, speaking to no one, acknowledging nothing. The humiliation was total and absolute. England knew. Spain knew. France knew. Rome knew. Every court in Europe now whispered about the barren queen who had imagined herself pregnant. Some called it madness. Others suggested witchcraft or divine punishment. None showed mercy. Philip wasted no time. Within days of the truth becoming undeniable, he departed for Flanders. He offered no comfort to his wife, no words of consolation. He simply left, his duty unfulfilled, his patience exhausted. Mary watched him go from the palace window, her hand pressed against the glass. She was alone now. Alone with the knowledge that her body had betrayed her in the cruelest possible way. Alone with the certainty that Elizabeth would inherit everything. Alone with a wound that had created the most elaborate lie her kingdom had ever witnessed. But the nightmare was far from over, because Mary's body was keeping darker secrets still. What happened to Mary Tudor has a name in modern medicine. Pseudocyesis, false pregnancy, a condition so rare that today it occurs in only 1 to 6 cases out of every 22,000 births. But in 1555, no physician in England understood what they were witnessing. Pseudocyesis is the mind's cruelest magic trick. When psychological pressure becomes unbearable, when desperation reaches a critical threshold, the body responds by manufacturing the very thing the mind craves. It is not pretending. It is not imagining. The symptoms are devastatingly real. The menstrual cycle stops completely. Hormones surge and crash in chaotic patterns. The abdomen swells as the intestines shift and bloat, mimicking the growth of a fetus. Weight accumulates around the midsection. Morning sickness erupts with the same violence as genuine pregnancy. The breasts enlarge, become tender, sometimes even produce milk as prolactin levels spike without any child to feed. The woman experiencing this is not lying. She is not delusional in the traditional sense. Her body is physically changing. Every symptom confirms what she desperately needs to believe. And the more people around her reinforce that belief, the deeper the body commits to the illusion. Mary Tudor was the perfect victim for this condition. Consider what her mind had endured. 20 years of trauma, beginning when her father declared her mother's marriage invalid and Mary herself illegitimate. She watched her mother die in exile, forbidden even to say goodbye. She lived under constant threat of execution during her Protestant brother's reign. She had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that her only value was in producing a Catholic heir. Then came the marriage to Philip, cold, political, loveless. But it represented her final chance. At 37, she was running out of time. Her entire life's purpose, her mother's vindication, the salvation of Catholic England, all hung on one biological imperative. Her womb had to deliver. The pressure was not merely personal. It was institutional. Parliament legislated around her fertility. Foreign ambassadors reported on her monthly cycles. The entire kingdom watched her body, speculating, hoping, demanding. Her womb was not her own. It belonged to England. So when her period stopped that September, her mind seized on it like a drowning woman grabbing driftwood. And her body, traumatized and desperate, began to cooperate. The hormones shifted. The abdomen distended. The nausea came. Every physical symptom validated the hope, and the hope intensified the symptoms in a terrible feedback loop. Modern psychologists understand this now. The body and mind are not separate entities. Trauma lives in flesh and bone as much as in memory. When the psychological burden becomes too heavy, it manifests physically. Mary's body was trying to solve a problem it could never solve. It was creating evidence of a pregnancy that would never result in a child. But pseudocyesis alone does not explain everything. Because beneath the phantom pregnancy, something else was growing inside Mary Tudor. Something dark and malignant that would eventually kill her. The tumor. In the year 2000, medical historian Dr. Milo Keynes analyzed every surviving document about Mary Tudor's health. Physician reports, ambassador observations, court records. He built a timeline of her symptoms spanning decades. And he reached a chilling conclusion. Mary likely had a pituitary tumor growing at the base of her skull, silently destroying her from within. The pituitary gland is tiny, no larger than a pea, but it controls the entire endocrine system. It orchestrates hormones, regulates reproduction, manages growth and metabolism. When a tumor develops there, even a benign one, the body descends into chaos. And the symptoms match Mary's suffering with horrifying precision. Start with her appearance. Multiple sources describe how Mary's eyebrows thinned and eventually disappeared almost completely. This is a classic sign of hypothyroidism, which pituitary tumors frequently cause. The gland stops producing thyroid-stimulating hormone, and the entire metabolic system begins to fail. The headaches that plagued her for years make terrible sense now. A tumor pressing against the surrounding brain tissue creates relentless pressure. The pain would have been constant, worsening over time as the growth expanded. Some days it would have been nearly unbearable, leaving her bedridden and unable to think clearly. Then there is the abdominal distension. Hypothyroidism causes severe constipation. The intestines slow to a crawl. Waste accumulates. The abdomen swells grotesquely, mimicking pregnancy so convincingly that even experienced physicians were fooled. Mary's belly was genuinely enlarged, but not by a child, by a digestive system shutting down. The tumor would also have caused prolactin levels to surge wildly. Prolactin is the hormone responsible for milk production. In Mary's case, it would have stopped her menstrual cycles entirely, created the breast swelling and tenderness, possibly even caused her breasts to leak. Every symptom screamed pregnancy. But it was cancer, not conception. Mental confusion and depression are also hallmarks of pituitary dysfunction. Mary's documented episodes of melancholy, her inability to think clearly during confinement, her periods of disconnection from reality, all align with hormonal devastation. The tumor was not just attacking her body, it was poisoning her mind. Perhaps most disturbing is what happened near the end of her life. Mary began losing her vision. She complained that everything appeared dim and shadowed. Eventually, she could barely see at all. Pituitary tumors grow upward, pressing directly against the optic nerves. As the mass expanded, it would have slowly crushed the nerves responsible for sight, plunging her into darkness. These tumors are typically benign. They grow slowly. But left untreated, they become prisons of flesh, trapping their victims in bodies that malfunction in every conceivable way. Mary lived with this for years, possibly decades. And in the 16th century, there was no surgery, no treatment, no hope. The tumor created the perfect conditions for phantom pregnancy. It manufactured the symptoms. It destroyed her fertility while simultaneously making her body insist she was fertile. It was a biological nightmare that no tutor physician could begin to comprehend. But the tumor was not working alone. While the tumor destroyed her from above, another affliction attacked from below. Medical historians believe Mary suffered from ovarian dropsy throughout her adult life. In modern terms, massive ovarian cysts that grew silently in the darkness of her body, swelling with fluid until her abdomen became a prison of pain. These cysts can grow to enormous sizes. Some reach the dimensions of a grapefruit, others larger still. They fill with liquid, expanding the ovaries until they press against surrounding organs. The bladder, the intestines, the spine. Every movement becomes agony. Mary complained constantly of abdominal pain. Sharp, stabbing sensations that doubled her over. Dull, persistent aches that never fully subsided. Her ladies recorded days when she could barely stand, when even breathing deeply caused her to gasp. This was not the phantom discomfort of pseudocyesis. This was real tissue damage, real inflammation, real suffering. The cysts would explain why her abdomen stayed distended even between her supposed pregnancies. While the pituitary tumor caused constipation and bloating, the ovarian masses added their own grotesque contribution. Her belly was genuinely swollen, genuinely hard to the touch. Multiple physicians examining her would have felt something solid. They simply misidentified what they were touching. Ovarian dropsy also causes amenorrhea. The menstrual cycle disrupts completely. But unlike the hormonal chaos from a pituitary tumor, this stems from physical obstruction. The ovaries become so enlarged and damaged they can no longer function properly. They stop releasing eggs. They stop producing the hormones necessary for regular cycles. August 1555 court records describe Mary suffering from low fever and dropsy. Dropsy was the tutor term for any condition causing fluid retention and swelling. But the specificity about abdominal dropsy points directly to ovarian pathology. The fever suggests infection, perhaps from a cyst rupturing or becoming inflamed. Here is the cruelest aspect. Even if Mary had somehow managed to conceive, These cysts made carrying a pregnancy to term virtually impossible. The ovarian environment was toxic. The uterus was compressed by the enlarged masses. There was no room for a fetus to grow, no healthy blood supply, no stable hormonal support. Her body was a graveyard for children who never had a chance to exist. The pain would have been unrelenting. Modern women with large ovarian cysts describe sensations like being stabbed repeatedly, like something twisting inside them, like pressure so intense they cannot eat or sleep. Mary endured this for years without morphine, without ultrasound, without any understanding of what was destroying her. Tudor physicians applied hot compresses. They bled her, believing bad humors caused the swelling. They gave her herbal tonics that did nothing. She suffered through treatments that were medieval torture, all while the true disease grew unchecked. The ovarian dropsy worked in tandem with the pituitary tumor, creating a symphony of symptoms that perfectly mimicked pregnancy. Together, they transformed her body into a liar. Together, they ensured she would never bear the child that might have saved her. And together, they were slowly killing her. Imagine waking every morning to a body you no longer recognize. This was Mary's existence. The tumor, the cysts, the phantom pregnancy, they did not work in isolation. They fed off each other, creating a cascade of symptoms that overwhelmed her system. Her heart betrayed her constantly. Court physicians documented episodes of palpitations, moments when her heart would suddenly race without warning. She described it as trembling inside her chest, a sensation so frightening she thought death was imminent. This was likely thyroid dysfunction causing cardiac arrhythmia, but to Mary, it felt like her body was trying to escape itself. Breathing became a struggle. The abdominal swelling pressed upward against her diaphragm, restricting lung expansion. Simple activities left her gasping. Walking across a room required rest. Climbing stairs became impossible some days. She who had once ridden horses and danced now could barely move without exhaustion crushing her. The fainting spells came without warning. She would be standing, speaking, functioning, and then darkness. Her ladies grew accustomed to catching her before she hit the floor. These episodes stemmed from multiple causes working together. Low blood pressure from hormonal imbalance, anemia from her disrupted system, perhaps even the tumor pressing on brain structures that regulated consciousness. Sleep offered no escape. Mary suffered from vivid, disturbing dreams that left her screaming in the night. She told her attendants about visions of children who dissolved into smoke when she reached for them, about chambers filling with blood, about voices calling her name from empty corridors. The psychological trauma was manifesting in her subconscious, turning rest into another form of torture. Her appetite vanished entirely during bad periods. Food tasted like ash. The smell of meat made her retch. When she did force herself to eat, the constipation and bloating that followed caused such agony she wished she had starved. Her body was rejecting nourishment, slowly consuming itself. The melancholy was perhaps worst of all. Not the normal sadness of disappointment, but a profound, crushing darkness that swallowed her for days at a time. She would lie motionless, staring at nothing, unreachable. Her attendants described it as though her soul had temporarily vacated her body, leaving only an empty shell behind. This was clinical depression, born from hormonal catastrophe and psychological devastation combined. Mary herself wrote that she had more unstable health than any creature. It was not self-pity. It was simple fact. Her body had become a catalog of medical disasters, each condition exacerbating the others. And the cruelest aspect? Every symptom that made pregnancy impossible simultaneously convinced her she was pregnant. The nausea, the swelling, the missing periods, the breast changes. Her diseases were master deceivers, creating hope from destruction. By 1557, she had endured 3 years of this living nightmare. 3 years of watching her body lie to her. 3 years of humiliation and pain. So when Philip returned that year, When the symptoms began again, when her body started screaming pregnancy for a second time, Heart of Mary must have known the truth. But hope, even false hope, is a powerful drug, and she was an addict desperate for one more dose. March 1557. Nearly 2 years had passed since Philip sailed away from England, leaving his wife broken in the wreckage of her false pregnancy. 2 years of silence. 2 years of Mary ruling alone, burning Protestants in increasing numbers, desperately trying to force England back to Rome through terror and conviction. Then Philip's ships appeared on the horizon. Mary received word of his approach and transformed. The melancholy that had settled over her like a burial shroud lifted instantly. She ordered new gowns made, consulted with her ladies about which perfumes he might prefer, practiced Spanish phrases she had forgotten. To anyone watching, it was painful. A 41-year-old woman preparing to receive a husband who had abandoned her, acting like a bride anticipating her wedding night. But Philip had not returned for love. He came because his father's empire was at war with France, and he needed England's support. Military alliance, financial backing, soldiers. That was the purpose of this visit. Nothing more. The reunion was cold and transactional. Philip spoke in formal tones. He discussed strategy with Mary's counselors, barely glancing at his wife during the meetings. At night, duty required he visit her chambers. Those visits were brief, mechanical, devoid of any tenderness. He was checking a box, fulfilling an obligation. But Mary saw what she needed to see. She interpreted duty as affection. She convinced herself that their marriage could still produce the miracle England required. At 41, she was not too old. Other women had borne children at advanced ages. God could still grant her this blessing. By summer, the now familiar signs emerged. Her courses stopped. Her body began changing again. The swelling returned to her abdomen. And against all logic, against the humiliation of 3 years prior, against every rational voice in her head, Mary declared herself pregnant. The court's reaction was markedly different this time. No bells rang. No bonfires blazed in celebration. Ambassadors wrote carefully worded dispatches that politely acknowledged the announcement without confirming belief. Parliament took no legislative action. Even Mary's own counselors exchanged worried glances but said nothing. Still, protocol demanded the charade continue. A nursery was prepared once more. Servants unpacked the tiny gowns that had been stored away unused. Wet nurses were quietly interviewed, though none showed much enthusiasm for the position. The royal physicians examined Mary and provided carefully neutral assessments that committed to nothing. Mary herself seemed almost manic in her joy. She placed her hands on her swelling belly and spoke to the child she insisted was growing there. She planned christening ceremonies and discussed the child's education. She walked through the palace with a brightness in her eyes that terrified those who knew the truth. Philip watched all of this with barely concealed discomfort. He had seen this before. He knew how it would end. But he needed England's military support, so he nodded and smiled and played his role until the war effort was secured. The baby was due in March 1558. Once again, spring would bring either a miracle or madness. Once again, everyone knew which was more likely. The pattern was identical, disturbingly, horrifically identical, as though Mary's body was replaying the same nightmare with perfect precision. Her belly expanded week by week. Her gowns required constant adjustment. She moved through the palace with her hands protectively cradling her abdomen, speaking softly to the child only she could feel. When questioned by her physicians, she described movement, kicks, the unmistakable quickening of life. But this time, no one shared her certainty. The court had learned caution. Servants whispered in corners about the Queen's delusion. Foreign diplomats sent reports filled with barely veiled pity and skepticism. England prepared for disappointment, not celebration. March 1558 arrived. The due date came and went without incident. Mary showed no sign of labor, no contractions, no breaking of waters, nothing. She insisted the physicians had miscalculated. The baby would come in April. God's timing was perfect, even if human understanding was flawed. April dissolved into May. The spring turned warm and hot. Mary's face grew drawn and pale, but her belly remained swollen. She refused to discuss the obvious. When counselors gently suggested consulting additional physicians, she dismissed them with rage. When her ladies tried to broach the subject delicately, she ordered them from her presence. But sometime in late May, something inside Mary finally broke. Perhaps it was seeing the pitying looks. Perhaps it was Philip's barely concealed impatience. Perhaps it was simply the weight of undeniable reality crushing down on her already fragile mind. She stopped talking about the baby. The silence was worse than the delusion had been. She withdrew to her private chambers and would not emerge for days. When she finally appeared, her eyes were empty, hollow. The manic brightness had been extinguished, replaced by nothing at all. No formal announcement was made. There was no need. The court simply stopped pretending. The nursery was quietly dismantled. The wet nurses were dismissed. The tiny gowns were packed away once more, this time with finality. Mary never spoke of it. Not to her counselors, not to her attendants, not even to her confessor. The second phantom pregnancy simply ended in silence, as though acknowledging it aloud would make the humiliation unbearable. But the damage was absolute. Where the first false pregnancy had humiliated her, the second destroyed her. There could be no more pretending, no more hope. Her body had proven itself incapable twice. She was 42 years old. Philip had already departed again for the continent, this time not even bothering with extended farewells. The succession was settled, not by her heir, but by her failure. Elizabeth would inherit. Protestant Elizabeth. Everything Mary had suffered for, fought for, burned people for, was already lost. She just had not died yet. That night, servants reported hearing the Queen weeping in her chambers. Not the dramatic sobs of grief, but quiet, broken sounds. The crying of someone who has finally accepted there is no hope left. Only the waiting for an end. Summer 1558 found Mary Tudor unrecognizable. The woman who had once defied her father's entire kingdom to defend her mother's marriage, who had raised an army and seized the throne from those who would deny her, who had ruled with iron conviction, was gone. What remained was a ghost wearing a crown. Sleep became impossible. Her attendants reported finding her at dawn, still dressed in the previous day's gowns, sitting motionless by the window, staring at nothing. When they tried to help her to bed, she would flinch away from their touch, as though contact itself caused pain. The insomnia ravaged what was left of her mind, leaving her thoughts fragmented and confused. During council meetings, she would lose track of conversations mid-sentence. Her advisers would ask her opinion on critical matters, and she would stare at them blankly, unable to process the question. Eventually, they stopped consulting her on anything but the most ceremonial decisions. The government functioned around her, not through her. The court no longer knew how to treat their queen. Pity and contempt mixed in equal measure. Younger courtiers who had not known her before the phantom pregnancies saw only a broken, possibly mad old woman. They bowed and curtsied with proper form, but their eyes held no respect. Some whispered that divine judgment had fallen upon her for the burnings, that God was punishing her barrenness as retribution for the Protestants who had died screaming in the flames. Her isolation deepened. Even her most loyal ladies found excuses to avoid extended time in her presence. The silence in her chambers became oppressive, broken only by Mary's occasional muttering to herself. Sometimes she prayed. Sometimes she spoke in fragments that made no sense. Other times she simply wept, though by now her tears were exhausted and came dry. Philip's letters, when they arrived at all, were brief and administrative. He never asked about her health. He never expressed concern or affection. He had already mentally divorced himself from this failed marriage, though Catholic law would not permit actual dissolution. To him, Mary was already dead. He was simply waiting for reality to catch up with his indifference. The physical deterioration accelerated. Mary's flesh began retaining fluid again, but this time it was not phantom pregnancy. This was her body shutting down. Her face grew puffy and distorted. Her ankles swelled so severely she could barely walk. Her abdomen, which had briefly receded after the second false pregnancy, began expanding again with fluid accumulation. The headaches that had plagued her for years intensified to unbearable levels. She would clutch her head and rock back and forth, moaning. No remedy provided relief. The tumor, growing unchecked, was entering its final destructive phase. But perhaps worst of all was the emptiness. Mary had always been driven by purpose, restoring Catholicism, producing an heir, vindicating her mother. Now all of those purposes were revealed as impossible. She had nothing left to live for, and her body was finally granting her the only mercy it ever would, death. Autumn arrived with unusual cold, the kind of cold that seeps into bones and refuses to leave. Mary felt it constantly now, shivering beneath layers of blankets, while fires roared in every hearth. Her body could no longer regulate its own temperature. The internal systems were failing one by one. Her vision, which had been dimming for months, deteriorated rapidly. Objects became shadows. Faces blurred into indistinct shapes. She had to be led by the hand through corridors she had walked for decades. The tumor was crushing her optic nerves, stealing the last sense that connected her to the world. Soon she would be trapped completely inside her failing body, blind to everything but her own suffering. In October, her physicians insisted she be moved from Hampton Court to St. James's Palace. The journey, normally simple, became an ordeal. Mary had to be carried on a litter, too weak to sit upright in a carriage. Crowds gathered to watch their queen pass, but she could not see their faces. She could only hear the murmurs, the whispered prayers, the occasional cruel comment from those who believed she deserved this fate. St. James's became her final prison. She rarely left her bedchamber. The room smelled of sickness and decay, despite the servants' constant efforts. Mary lay in her massive bed, a tiny figure dwarfed by velvet and wood, her body swollen beyond recognition. The dropsy had reached its peak. Her flesh was waterlogged, her features distorted. She was drowning from the inside. Then November brought influenza. A vicious strain swept through London, killing hundreds. It invaded the palace despite every precaution. And Mary, with her destroyed immune system, had no defense. The fever came first. Her skin burned while her body shook with chills. Then the cough, deep and rattling, each spasm causing her agony as it jarred her tumor-riddled brain. Her attendants tried everything, but nothing could break the fever. It climbed higher, pulling her consciousness away from reality. By November 17th, Mary was barely aware of her surroundings. She drifted in and out, her breathing labored and irregular. Her ladies kept vigil, knowing the end was near. In those final hours, Mary spoke, fevered words that made her attendants weep. She described seeing children, beautiful children with golden hair, playing at the foot of her bed. They were singing, she said, such sweet voices, laughing and reaching for her. She tried to lift her hands toward them, but her body would not respond. The children she never had, the phantoms that destroyed her, even in death, they would not release her. As dawn broke on November 17th, 1558, Mary Tudor stopped breathing. The struggle ended. Her body, which had betrayed her at every turn, finally granted her the only mercy it knew. She died blind, feverish, alone, reaching for children made of fever and desperation. And with her died the last hope of Catholic England. For centuries after Mary's death, historians argued about what killed her. Some blamed melancholy. Others suggested poison. Religious propagandists on both sides claimed divine judgment. But Mary Tudor did not die from God's wrath or political conspiracy. She died from a perfect storm of medical disasters that 16th century physicians could never have understood. Modern analysis reveals the terrible truth. Mary likely suffered from 3 separate conditions simultaneously, each feeding into the others, creating a cascade of destruction that made survival impossible. The pituitary tumor formed first, possibly as early as her teenage years. It grew slowly, silently, at the base of her skull. Year after year it expanded, pressing against brain tissue, disrupting the delicate hormonal balance her body required. The tumor caused her hypothyroidism, her vanishing eyebrows, her metabolic collapse. It sent her prolactin levels surging, stopping her periods and preparing her breasts for children who would never exist. It gave her crushing headaches that no remedy could touch. And in her final months, it pressed against her optic nerves until the world went dark. The ovarian cysts developed independently, likely triggered by the same hormonal chaos the tumor created. These masses filled with fluid and expanded inside her, causing the constant abdominal pain she endured for decades. They made her belly swell convincingly, mimicking pregnancy so perfectly that even experienced royal physicians were deceived. They destroyed any possibility of her actually conceiving and carrying a child to term, even as they created symptoms that screamed fertility. Then came pseudocyesis, the phantom pregnancy itself. This was not a separate disease, but the psychological response to unbearable pressure manifesting through her already compromised body. The tumor and cysts had prepared the stage. Her traumatized mind simply activated the performance. Her desperate need for a child triggered her broken endocrine system to produce every symptom of pregnancy without any actual conception. These 3 conditions worked together like a conspiracy. The tumor disrupted her hormones. The cysts provided physical evidence. The pseudocyesis convinced her mind to accept the lie. Together, they created an illusion so complete that Mary lived inside it for months, twice, unable to escape until reality forced itself upon her with brutal clarity. But none of these killed her directly. They simply weakened her until she had nothing left to fight with. When influenza swept through London in November 1558, Mary's immune system was already destroyed. The virus found a body with no defenses, ravaged by tumor and cyst and starvation and despair. The infection moved through her like fire through dry wood. Some medical historians believe cancer was also developing, though whether in her ovaries, her pituitary region, or elsewhere remains uncertain. At 42, her body was failing from multiple angles simultaneously. The official cause of death was listed as influenza, but that was merely the final blow. What truly killed Mary Tudor was her own body, turning against her in every possible way, until nothing remained but suffering and the mercy of death. Mary Tudor never owned her own body. From the moment she became queen, her womb ceased to be a private organ and became a matter of state. Every aspect of her physical being was monitored, discussed, legislated, and judged by men who saw her not as a person, but as a vessel for the next heir. Parliament did not wait for a pregnancy announcement. They immediately passed laws dictating what would happen when she conceived, who would rule if she died in childbirth, how power would transfer based on the sex of the infant. They legislated her fertility before it even existed. Her body was not hers to control. It belonged to England. Foreign ambassadors made her menstrual cycle their business. They tracked when her periods came and went, reporting every detail to their kings and emperors. The Venetian ambassador, the Spanish envoy, the French diplomat, all of them keeping meticulous records of the most intimate aspects of her physical existence. When her bleeding stopped, letters flew across Europe announcing the possibility before Mary herself had time to process it. Her clothing choices were analyzed for signs of pregnancy. Was her waist thicker? Were her gowns adjusted? Did she refuse wine at dinner? Every gesture, every dietary change, Every alteration to her wardrobe became evidence to be examined and reported. Mary could not exist privately. She lived under constant surveillance. The physicians had license to invade her body in ways that would horrify modern sensibilities. They pressed and prodded her abdomen. They asked explicit questions about her conjugal relations with Philip. They examined her breasts, her skin, her waist. All of this was considered necessary and proper because her body was not her own. It was a national resource. Even Philip treated her body as transactional. He visited her bed as duty, not desire. His presence in England was calculated around her fertility. When she proved barren, he left. When political necessity required her military support, he returned and performed his marital obligations with mechanical efficiency. Her body was a bargaining chip in his father's imperial games. This pressure was not merely uncomfortable. It was lethal. Modern medicine understands that chronic stress destroys the body at a cellular level. It disrupts hormones, weakens the immune system, exacerbates existing conditions. Mary lived under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Her body responded by creating the very symptoms everyone was watching for, even though no pregnancy existed. The psychological burden manifested as physical disease. Her desperate need for a child, amplified by political necessity and public scrutiny, literally triggered her body to mimic pregnancy. The pseudocyesis was not separate from the pressure. It was the direct result of it. Mary's tragedy reveals the dark truth about female power in the 16th century. A woman could wear the crown, but she could not control her own flesh. Her body was public property, a battleground where political ambitions were fought, and she was simply the territory being conquered. The pressure did not just humiliate her. It killed her. Slowly, agonizingly, inevitably. History has a cruel sense of irony, and nowhere is that more evident than in Mary Tudor's legacy. She earned the name Bloody Mary by burning nearly 300 Protestants at the stake. Men and women who refused to renounce their faith were tied to posts and set ablaze while crowds watched. The smoke from Smithfield carried the screams of the dying across London. Mary ordered this. She believed it was necessary. In her mind, these executions were not cruelty. They were salvation. Every heretic burned was a soul saved from eternal damnation, a warning to others who might stray from Rome. More importantly, every execution was meant to purify England, to make it worthy of the Catholic heir she would produce, the child who would continue her holy work, the child who would ensure Protestant heresy never returned. But there would be no child, and that failure transformed everything. On November 17th, 1558, hours after Mary drew her last breath, her half-sister Elizabeth was proclaimed queen. Protestant Elizabeth, the woman Mary had imprisoned in the Tower, the woman she suspected of treason, the woman who represented everything Mary had spent 5 years trying to destroy. Within months, Elizabeth began dismantling Mary's Catholic restoration. The Protestant settlement returned. The heresy laws were repealed. The executions stopped. England turned away from Rome with stunning speed, as though the previous 5 years had been a nightmare best forgotten. Every policy Mary implemented vanished. Every alliance she forged crumbled. Every sacrifice she demanded became meaningless. The Protestants Mary burned had died for nothing from her perspective. But from Elizabeth's reign, they became martyrs whose blood seeded the Anglican Church. John Fox's Book of Martyrs immortalized their suffering and branded Mary as a monster for generations. The very persecutions meant to save Catholic England became the propaganda that destroyed its possibility forever. Mary's obsession with producing an heir had made her vulnerable in ways that proved catastrophic. Philip of Spain recognized her desperation and exploited it mercilessly. He returned to England not for love, but for military alliance, knowing she would grant him anything if he simply played the role of dutiful husband. She committed England to his disastrous war with France, losing Calais in the process. The last English territory on the continent held for 200 years, gone because Mary needed Philip's presence enough to buy it with her kingdom's strategic interests. Her credibility never recovered from the phantom pregnancies. By the time she tried to rally support for her religious policies, courtiers and common people alike viewed her with pity or contempt. A queen who had twice announced pregnancies that produced nothing could not command the respect necessary to transform a nation's soul. The greatest irony is this: if Mary had simply ruled without the desperate focus on childbearing, she might have secured her religious legacy through other means. But her womb became her obsession, her weakness, her ultimate failure. And that failure handed England to the woman who would make it Protestant forever. Everything Mary fought for died with her. Everything she feared came to pass. Her body's betrayal was also England's transformation. 467 years have passed since Mary Tudor died, reaching for phantom children. Yet her case remains one of the most extensively documented examples of pseudosciences in medical history. Physicians and psychologists still study the meticulous records kept by her attendants. The ambassador reports, the court documents that tracked every symptom. Her suffering became a textbook case, her tragedy reduced to clinical terminology in medical journals. But the cold medical language cannot capture the true horror of what happened in those sealed birthing chambers. Imagine the darkness, the tapestries blocking every window, the air thick with smoke from constantly burning fires. Imagine waiting. 1 week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months. The attendants watching their queen curl into herself, rocking and murmuring, her hands clutching a belly that would never deliver. 11 months, she insisted the child was coming. 11 months of deepening delusion, while everyone around her knew the terrible truth, but could not speak it. The women who attended her carried that trauma for the rest of their lives. They watched a human mind fracture, under pressure so immense it literally reshaped her body. They heard her speak to the baby that did not exist, felt her grab their hands and place them on her abdomen to feel kicks that were only intestinal spasms. They witnessed psychological torture that had no name in their time, no treatment, no hope of intervention. Tudor England had no framework for understanding what was happening. They believed in humors and divine will, in punishment and blessing. They could not comprehend that Mary's own mind was weaponizing her body against her, that trauma could manifest as physical disease, that desperate hope could become a medical condition. So they simply watched, helpless and horrified, as their queen descended into a nightmare from which there was no waking. The attendants who were with her at the end reported the fever-dreamed children with trembling voices. They described how Mary's face transformed when she saw them, how she smiled for the first time in months, how she reached out with hands so swollen from dropsy they barely resembled human appendages. She called to them, told them to come closer, said she had been waiting so long. Those children were the cruelest gift her dying brain could offer. The final illusion, the ultimate betrayal. Even in death, her mind could not grant her peace. It could only show her what she would never have, dangling hope one last time before extinguishing it forever. Mary Tudor's greatest enemy was never Elizabeth, never the Protestants, never even Philip's indifference. Her enemy lived inside her skull and her womb. It was tumor and cyst and trauma made flesh. It was a body that turned desire into disease, hope into horror, until nothing remained but a blind, fever-racked woman dying alone, reaching for children made of desperation and darkness. That is the legacy of the cursed womb. Not political failure or religious defeat, but the pure medical horror of a body becoming its own executioner. And the children in the shadows, forever waiting, forever out of reach.